I teach freshman composition. Every so often during the course of the semester, I have my students read E.B. White's essay Once More to the Lake. In the essay, the narrator is returning to the place that he vacationed with his family when he was a child. He's now a grown man with a young son of his own. He realizes certain things have changed. For instance, the boats on the lake now have outboard motors, sound that is foreign to his ears. Yet so much about the place has remained the same, untouched by time. He begins to confuse the past with the present, at times seeing himself in his son, and at other times feeling like his own father. As he watches his son pull wet swim trunks onto his small body, the narrator feels the chill of death as he comes face to face with his own mortality. The significance of this essay is lost on many traditional freshman comp students. For one thing, White wrote the piece in 1941, so it is certainly dated. For another, most 18 to 20-year-olds haven't given much thought to their own mortality. I've considered dropping this essay from my syllabus, but each time I think about it, I'm compelled to leave it as part of the course. I do this for purely selfish reasons. I have my own lake, Lake Champlain, which runs the length of the state of Vermont. It meanders along the western border of the state, dividing the two states of Vermont and New York. My family began vacationing on Grand Isle when I was 3 years old. Grand Isle sits on a small string of islands in the northern part of the lake, not far from the Canadian border. Locals refer to this spot as the Islands. However, you can get there by car if you drive over a narrow causeway. The first lakeside cabins we vacationed in were clustered in a secluded area known as Sandy Cove. I remember wearing a red, white, and blue striped life jacket that dwarfed my 3-year-old body as I frolicked in the icy water. That first summer we met 2 other families who were also vacationing there. Together we were the end of the alphabet families, the Zazalis, the Zigmonts, and the Yandos. Teddy and Shirley Yando had 2 small children, John and Lisa. I remember playing matchbox cars with John in the sand. Lisa was just a baby. John and Ann Zigmont were their grandparents. Charlie and Casey were John Zigmont's younger brothers, who were vacationing with their wives, Adeline and Pat. Charlie, Teddy, John, and my father spent each morning out on the lake fishing from Charlie's turquoise and white motorboat. Afternoons were filled with water skiing and baseball games, after which the adults could be found flopped into lawn chairs for happy hour, which included drinks and fish stories. Each night we had a bonfire on the beach. We wrapped potatoes and corn on the cob in aluminum foil and cooked them in the coals. I still remember the burnt taste on my tongue. A few years later, Sandy Cove closed down, and all 3 families moved down the road to White's cottages. My grandparents now joined us for part of the 2-week vacation. There were 3 bedrooms in this cabin, but privacy was non-existent, since none of the walls extended all the way to the ceiling. My sisters and I slept in one room directly across from my grandparents. Pillow fights over the wall were a common occurrence, and each night we would say goodnight just like the Waltons did. Night, John boy. Night, Elizabeth. Each summer we anxiously awaited the last 2 weeks of July, when we knew we would head north out of the grind of New Jersey to the quiet of the Green Mountain State. We would renew old friendships and make new ones. I remember when my sister Pat caught some sheep's head, the ugliest fish you have ever seen. She wanted to keep the heads in order to cut out the stones behind the eyes, which supposedly were beautiful. That night she put the fish heads in a bucket under the cabin for safekeeping. Before long we were all awakened by the pungent odor of skunk. We never did get to see what those stones looked like, and we didn't get any sleep that night either. I did a lot of growing up during those 2 weeks each summer. I met my first boyfriend at White's cottages. His name was Carl Pratt, and he was staying in the campground next to the cabins. He was 13. I was 11, but I lied and said I was 13 too. One night after the bonfire, he walked me back across the field to our cottage. He put his arm around me, and I shivered from a rush of emotions I had never before experienced. The next day I told my mother all about it. She just smiled. In the mid-70s, we moved a few miles down Route 2 to Hislop's Landing. Our new cabin had the ugliest swordfish mounted on the wall above the couch, and from the moment we saw it, we knew the fish would become part of our traditions. Each year, we all had our photos taken in front of the same fish on the same wall. Thankfully, over the years, the couch was replaced at least once. We begin to take things for granted when life is consistent. Each year, we all returned to the lake. Yes, we were changing, but overall, the feel of the place, of the time, remained the same, until our first loss. One winter in the early 80s, Charlie Zygmunt, who over the years had become my dad's best friend, died, much too young, from cancer. The following summer was not quite the same. Charlie wasn't in the fishing boat with his good luck hat on, grinning from ear to ear as he gave the worms fishing lessons. He wasn't whooping it up while he water skied like he was still 20 years old. He wasn't next door shouting "Happy Hour" so that everyone within a mile could hear him. He wasn't there to make us laugh. He wasn't there for my dad. It seemed so odd. Everything else was still the same. I remember feeling that if I closed my eyes and concentrated, I could make him reappear in his usual spot on the deck. During my teenage years, I still enjoyed going to what we had come to call camp. But as happens with most teens, I no longer enjoyed being under my parents' roof. The older I got, the later I stayed out with the locals. Each summer usually brought a new romantic interest, and I spent more and more time away from the cabin and my family. Once I started college, my appearances at camp became sporadic. I had summer jobs, then I moved across the country to begin a career and start a family of my own. I did make it back for the 30th anniversary in 1997. After a lengthy fight and a long drive in a rental car, I felt my body and mind begin to relax as we neared Grand Isle. I opened the car window, sighed, and breathed deeply. Yes, it smelled the same, like cows, wet grass, and summer rain. We rounded a familiar curve after crossing over the sandbar into the islands, and I closed my eyes and crossed my fingers. Cautiously, I opened one eye to peek at the approaching vegetable stand. When I saw Mr. Montani stooped behind his weathered makeshift stand, I breathed a sigh of relief. If after 30 years that old farmer, who was old when I was 3, was still there, I knew everything else would have remained unchanged. As we pulled into Hislop's Landing, I smiled as I caught sight of the lake. There was the same cabin, the same dock, and even the same green and white boat that my father has had since 1970. Even without seeing it, I knew that Charlie Zygmunt's fishing pole was carefully tucked inside the boat. It's the only pole my dad used since Charlie died. Yes, all of our lives had changed. Adeline, Ann, Casey, and Pat had passed away. John was in a veterans hospital. My parents' generation had become the oldest. Yet a new generation had been born. My sisters and I had 6 children between us. John and Lisa Yando each had 1. There was a sense of joy and hope as we shared the experiences of camp with our own children, while our parents, now the grandparents, looked on. Not long after that summer, my parents grew too frail to handle the annual trip. My mother's arthritis made it impossible for her to manage her way to the cabin safely. My father no longer had the strength to manage the boat. For a few years we went without them, and then we just stopped. Life, however, kept moving forward. Today the Zygmunts are all gone, as are my own sister and my father. My children are now 15. During a trip home to Vermont in the summer of 2011, we heard that the Yandos were going to be at camp, and so we got in the car and drove up Route 2 to the islands. I knew, of course, that Mr. Montani's farm stand would no longer be there. And yet, when we pulled down the rutted dirt road toward the lake, I squinted my eyes just enough to blur my peripheral vision. Yes, it could have easily been 1997, or 87, 77, or 67. We gathered near the old worn-out picnic table that sits between the cabins in order to get a photo of those who remain. While I stood there, gazing at the lake and smiling for the camera, I felt the exhilaration of life. I felt the cold shiver of death.